In a small, cozy diner tucked away on the outskirts of a quiet town, life moved at its own unhurried pace. The diner wasn't fancy. Its walls were painted a faded yellow, and the vinyl booths showed signs of wear from years of use, but it had a charm that drew people in. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other's names, where laughter mingled with the clinking of coffee mugs, and where stories unfolded over plates of pancakes and scrambled eggs. Sarah Harper was one of the waitresses who kept the diner running smoothly. She was in her early 30s with curly brown hair tied back into a loose ponytail and warm hazel eyes that always seemed to sparkle, even when she was tired. Life hadn't been easy for Sarah. A single mother raising a 6-year-old son named Jake, she worked long hours to make ends meet. Her days started before sunrise and often ended well after sunset, but she never let her struggles show while she was on the clock. To her customers, Sarah was the epitome of kindness, a bright smile, a quick joke, and an uncanny ability to remember exactly how they liked their coffee. On this particular morning, the air outside was crisp, carrying the faint bite of winter. The streets were still damp from an overnight drizzle, and the sky was painted in shades of gray. Inside the diner, however, the atmosphere was warm and inviting. The smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the room, mingling with the aroma of sizzling bacon and buttered toast. Sarah bustled around, refilling cups and taking orders, her cheerful demeanor lighting up the space. Around 7:30 a.m., just as the breakfast rush began to taper off, the doorbell jingled softly, announcing the arrival of a new customer. Sarah glanced up, expecting to see one of the regulars, a truck driver grabbing a quick bite before hitting the road or a local shopkeeper stopping by for his usual morning coffee. Instead, she saw an elderly man stepping inside. He looked out of place, almost as if he didn't belong in the bustling diner. His clothes were simple, a dark coat that had seen better days, a scarf wrapped loosely around his neck, and scuffed shoes that whispered of countless miles walked. His face bore the lines of age, but his eyes held a quiet intensity, as though they carried secrets untold. The man hesitated for a moment, glancing around the room before making his way to a corner booth. It was the kind of seat people chose when they wanted to be left alone, tucked away from the main flow of activity, offering a view of the entire diner without drawing attention. Sarah watched him settle in, noticing the way he carefully folded his hands on the table and stared at the menu with an expression of deep concentration. Something about him tugged at her heartstrings. Maybe it was the slight tremor in his hands as he adjusted his glasses, or the way he seemed to shrink into himself, as though trying to become invisible. Curious and concerned, Sarah decided to approach him. Grabbing a pot of coffee and a clean mug, she walked over to his booth, her sneakers squeaking softly against the tiled floor. "Good morning," she said warmly, placing the mug on the table. "Can I get you started with some coffee?" The man looked up, startled, as if he hadn't expected anyone to speak to him. For a brief second their eyes met, and Sarah felt a strange sense of familiarity as though she'd known him for years. "Oh, yes, thank you," he replied, his voice soft and gravelly, like the sound of distant thunder. There was a hesitation in his tone, a hint of uncertainty that made Sarah wonder if he was debating whether to stay or leave. She smiled reassuringly. "No problem. Let me know if you need anything else." As she turned to walk away, she couldn't help but notice how thin the man looked. His cheeks were sunken, and there was a fragility to him that reminded her of her own grandfather, who had passed away a few years ago. Determined to make him feel welcome, she lingered near the counter, keeping an eye on him as she tended to other tables. After a few minutes, the man finally signaled for her attention. When Sarah returned, notepad in hand, he cleared his throat nervously. "I'll have just a cup of black coffee, please," he said, fumbling with the menu. His fingers traced the prices listed beside each item, lingering on the cheaper options. Sarah caught the subtle movement and immediately understood what was going on. Money, or the lack thereof, was clearly weighing heavily on his mind. Without missing a beat, Sarah gave him a reassuring nod. "Coming right up," she said brightly, jotting down his order. But instead of ringing it up at the register, she slipped behind the counter and prepared the coffee herself. As she poured the steaming liquid into the mug, she added a splash of cream and a sprinkle of sugar, knowing full well that most people preferred their coffee sweetened even if they didn't ask for it. When she brought the mug back to his table, she set it down gently and said, "Here you go, on the house." The man blinked in surprise, his weathered face breaking into a tentative smile. "That's very kind of you," he murmured, his voice tinged with gratitude. "But are you sure? I don't want to cause any trouble." "No trouble at all," Sarah assured him, waving off his concern. "We've got plenty of coffee to go around. Besides, it looks like you could use a little warmth this morning." Her words hung in the air, simple yet profound. The man nodded slowly, his gaze dropping to the mug in front of him. For a moment, he seemed lost in thought, as though her kindness had stirred something deep within him. Sarah lingered for a moment, longer, sensing that he might want to talk, but when he remained silent, she excused herself and returned to her duties. As the morning wore on, Sarah found herself glancing at the man every now and then. He sipped his coffee slowly, savoring each drop, and occasionally scribbled something in a small notebook he pulled from his coat pocket. Despite his reserved demeanor, there was an undeniable presence about him, a quiet dignity that commanded respect. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this stranger than met the eye. By the time the lunch crowd began trickling in, the man had finished his coffee and was preparing to leave. He stood up slowly, wincing slightly as though his joints were stiff, and reached into his pocket. Pulling out a handful of coins, he approached the counter where Sarah was busy ringing up another customer's bill. Waiting patiently for her attention, he placed the coins on the counter and said, "For the coffee, and thank you." Sarah looked at the coins, a modest sum, far less than the actual cost of the drink, and shook her head firmly. "Keep it," she insisted, pushing the coins back toward him. "Like I said, it's on the house. No charge." The man hesitated, his lips curving into a faint smile. "You're too kind," he said softly. Then after a pause, he added, "My name is Mr. Whitaker. If you ever need anything, well, let's just say I won't forget this." With that, he turned and walked out of the diner, disappearing into the chilly morning air. Sarah watched him go, a mixture of curiosity and compassion swirling in her chest. She didn't know it then, but that seemingly ordinary encounter would set the stage for an extraordinary journey, one that would challenge her beliefs, test her character, and ultimately change her life forever. The days passed and Sarah returned to her usual routine at the diner. Life in the small town carried on as it always did, steady, predictable, and uneventful. Yet something about Mr. Whitaker lingered in her mind long after their brief encounter. His quiet demeanor, his hesitant smile, and the way he seemed so grateful for a simple cup of coffee stayed with her like an unfinished story waiting to be resolved. She wondered who he was, where he had come from, and why he appeared to carry the weight of the world on his shoulders. To her surprise, Mr. Whitaker returned to the diner just 3 days later. This time, he didn't hesitate when he walked in. He nodded politely at Sarah before heading straight to the same corner booth he'd occupied before. It was almost as if he felt comfortable there, as though that spot had become his own little sanctuary. Sarah noticed him glance around the room briefly, taking in the familiar sights and sounds before settling into his seat with a sense of ease. When Sarah approached him, she greeted him warmly. "Good morning, Mr. Whitaker. Back for more coffee?" she asked with a playful smile, her tone light and friendly. He chuckled softly, the sound barely audible above the hum of conversation in the diner. "Yes, I suppose I am," he replied, his voice carrying a hint of amusement. "Your coffee is quite memorable." Sarah grinned, pleased by the compliment. "Well, we do take pride in our brew here," she teased, reaching for the pot of coffee. As she poured him a fresh cup, she couldn't help but notice how different he seemed compared to other customers. Most people chatted casually or joked around while they waited for their orders, but Mr. Whitaker remained reserved, almost contemplative. There was a stillness about him, as if he were observing everything quietly, soaking in the details without saying a word. Over the next few weeks, Mr. Whitaker became a regular at the diner. He came almost every morning, always sitting in the same booth and ordering nothing more than his black coffee. Occasionally, he would ask for a slice of toast or a plain bagel, but even those requests were rare. Sarah began to look forward to his visits, not because he tipped generously, he left only small change, but because there was something comforting about his presence. He wasn't loud or demanding. Instead, he exuded a quiet calm that seemed to settle over the entire diner whenever he was there. What struck Sarah most, however, was how little he revealed about himself. Despite her attempts to strike up conversations, Mr. Whitaker remained guarded, offering vague answers to her questions. When she asked where he lived, he simply said, "Not far." When she inquired about his family, he responded with a polite, "I'm afraid I don't have much to share on that front." And yet, despite his reticence, there was no hostility in his manner. On the contrary, he seemed genuinely appreciative of Sarah's efforts to engage him. One morning, as Sarah delivered his coffee, she decided to try a different approach. Instead of asking direct questions, she shared a bit about herself. "You know, my son Jake loves coming here after school," she said, leaning against the edge of the booth. "He says it smells like home. I guess that's a good thing, right?" Mr. Whitaker's eyes softened and a faint smile played on his lips. "Children have a way of seeing the beauty in simplicity," he remarked thoughtfully. "It's refreshing, isn't it?" Sarah nodded, encouraged by his response. "Yeah, it really is. Sometimes I think adults could learn a lot from kids. They don't overcomplicate things, they just enjoy the moment." For the first time since they'd met, Mr. Whitaker leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the table. "And what moments do you enjoy, Sarah?" he asked, his gaze steady and curious. Caught off guard by the question, Sarah hesitated for a moment. I guess I enjoy the little things," she admitted. "Like watching Jake laugh or seeing the sunrise on my way to work. Even silly stuff like finding a perfectly ripe avocado at the grocery store. It's the small victories, you." "No," Mr. Whitaker chuckled softly, nodding in agreement. "The small victories," he repeated as if testing the phrase on his tongue. "Yes, I suppose those are the ones that truly matter." Their conversation ended there, but it left Sarah feeling a strange sense of connection. For the first time, she felt as though she'd glimpsed a sliver of the man behind the quiet exterior. Beneath his reserved nature lay someone thoughtful, observant, and perhaps even lonely. She found herself wondering what his life was like outside the diner. Did he have friends, family, a home filled with memories? Or was he, like so many others, drifting through life unnoticed? As the weeks turned into months, Sarah continued treating Mr. Whitaker with the same warmth and kindness she extended to all her customers. But she also began noticing subtle changes in him. He started lingering longer in the diner, sipping his coffee slowly as though reluctant to leave. He occasionally brought a book or a notebook with him, jotting down notes or sketching doodles in the margins. Once, Sarah caught a glimpse of what looked like financial figures scribbled across the page, but when she asked about it, he quickly closed the notebook and changed the subject. Despite his growing comfort in the diner, Mr. Whitaker remained an enigma. Sarah often wondered if he realized how much his presence meant to her. In a world that sometimes felt cold and indifferent, his quiet appreciation for the smallest gestures, a warm cup of coffee, a kind word, reminded her of the power of human connection. He never complained, never demanded special treatment, and always expressed gratitude, even for the simplest things. Meanwhile, unbeknownst to Sarah, Mr. Whitaker was wrestling with his own thoughts. Beneath his unassuming appearance lay a man whose life had been anything but ordinary. Edward Whitaker III had built an empire from scratch, turning innovative ideas into billion-dollar ventures. His name was synonymous with success, and his face had once graced the covers of countless magazines. But wealth, he had discovered, came with its own set of burdens. People flocked to him not for who he was, but for what he could offer. Friends became acquaintances, and trust became a luxury he could no longer afford. Disillusioned by the superficiality of the world he inhabited, Edward had retreated from the spotlight years ago. He sold his mansion, gave away most of his possessions, and adopted a simpler lifestyle. Traveling from town to town, he sought solace in places where no one recognized him, hoping to rediscover the humanity he feared he'd lost. The diner, and Sarah, had been a stroke of serendipity. Her genuine kindness stood out like a beacon in a sea of indifference, reminding him of a time when compassion was still valued over material gain. Yet, even as he grew fond of Sarah, Edward remained cautious. Was her kindness truly selfless, or was it motivated by something else? He had seen too many people feign interest in him only to reveal their true intentions later. Determined to find out, he resolved to test her character, not out of suspicion, but out of hope. If Sarah proved to be as sincere as she seemed, then perhaps he had finally found someone worthy of trust. Little did either of them know, their lives were about to intersect in ways neither could have anticipated. What began as a simple act of generosity, a cup of coffee given freely, was about to blossom into something far greater. And as winter gave way to spring, the seeds of friendship planted in that humble diner would grow into a bond that neither distance nor circumstance could break. As the weeks melted into months, Mr. Whitaker's visits to the diner became as predictable as the sunrise. He arrived each morning just after 7:30, always wearing his worn coat and frayed scarf, always claiming the same corner booth. Sarah had grown accustomed to his presence, finding comfort in the quiet rhythm of their interactions. She brought him his coffee without being asked, sometimes slipping a slice of toast onto his plate, because it looked like it was about to go stale anyway. Her jokes were lighthearted, her smiles genuine, and though Mr. Whitaker rarely laughed, his eyes often softened with gratitude. But beneath his calm exterior, Edward Whitaker, billionaire turned wanderer, was grappling with questions that had haunted him for years. Could anyone be trusted in a world where greed and selfishness seemed to reign supreme? Was there still room for authenticity, or had humanity lost its way entirely? Every day, he watched Sarah move through the diner with grace and kindness, treating everyone equally regardless of who they were or what they could offer her. Yet he couldn't shake the nagging doubt that perhaps her actions weren't as pure as they appeared. Perhaps she too harbored hidden motives. Determined to find out, Edward began testing her character, not maliciously, but cautiously, like dipping one's toes into icy water. One chilly morning, he walked into the diner, looking unusually disheveled. His hands trembled more than usual, and his coat was buttoned crookedly, as if he'd dressed hastily. When Sarah greeted him, he hesitated before speaking. I seem to have misplaced my wallet," he admitted, his voice tinged with embarrassment. "Would it be all right if I paid for my coffee later?" Sarah didn't even blink. "Of course, Mr. Whitaker," she said warmly, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Don't worry about it. You're family here." Her words caught him off guard. Family. It wasn't a term he used lightly, nor one he associated with himself anymore. The last time someone had called him family, it had been decades ago, when his late wife was still alive. Now, standing in this humble diner, hearing those words from a woman who barely knew him, he felt an unfamiliar lump rise in his throat. Over the next few days, Edward continued dropping subtle hints about his struggles. He mentioned how difficult it was to carry groceries home, especially since his arthritis made lifting heavy bags nearly impossible. Another time, he casually remarked how lonely evenings could feel when there was no one to share them with. Each confession was met with Sarah's immediate concern and action. One afternoon after closing time, Sarah approached his booth holding a paper bag filled with leftover pastries. "I thought you might like these," she said, setting the bag down gently. "They won't stay fresh overnight, and I figured you could use a little treat." Edward stared at the bag, momentarily speechless. "That's very kind of you," he managed to say, his voice thick with emotion. "But aren't you worried I'll eat them all at once and spoil my dinner?" Sarah laughed, the sound bright and melodic. "Spoiling your dinner is the least of my worries," she teased. "Besides, everyone deserves a treat now and then." Another evening, when Edward lingered in the diner longer than usual, Sarah sat across from him during her break. "You know," she began, stirring sugar into her own cup of tea, "if you ever need help with anything, groceries, errands, whatever, you can always ask me. I don't mind pitching in." Edward raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "And what makes you think I'd accept such an offer?" Sarah shrugged, her expression earnest. "Because we take care of each other around here. That's just how it works." Her simplicity stunned him. In his previous life, offers of assistance usually came with strings attached. People wanted something in return, a favor, a connection, a slice of his fortune. But Sarah seemed genuinely unconcerned with repayment. Her generosity flowed freely, unburdened by expectation. Still, Edward needed to push further. If he was going to trust her completely, he had to ensure her kindness wasn't limited to minor gestures. So one snowy morning he arrived at the diner visibly distressed. His hand shook as he clutched the edge of the counter, and his breathing was labored. Sarah rushed to his side immediately. "Mr. Whitaker, are you okay?" she asked, her brow furrowed with worry. "I'm fine," he assured her, though his pale face told a different story. "It's just, I slipped on some ice outside. My ankle feels twisted." Without hesitation, Sarah grabbed her phone. "Let me call someone to come get you," she offered. No, Edward protested weakly. "I'll manage. I just need a moment to rest." Sarah didn't argue. Instead, she helped him to his usual booth, fetched a heating pad from the back and wrapped it carefully around his ankle. Then, despite the growing line of customers waiting to be served, she stayed with him, chatting softly to distract him from the pain. After ensuring he was comfortable, she stepped away briefly to prepare a thermos of hot tea. "For the road?" she explained, pressing it into his hands. "Just in case you feel cold on the way home." Edward accepted the thermos, his fingers brushing against hers. For a fleeting moment, their eyes locked, and he saw something in her gaze that he hadn't seen in years. Sincerity. Pure, unadulterated sincerity. It was a rare gem in a world clouded by pretense, and it left him both humbled and hopeful. Despite her busy schedule, Sarah continued checking on him throughout the day. She called him that evening to make sure he was doing better, and the next morning she arrived at the diner carrying a pair of sturdy boots. "I thought these might help," she said, handing them to him. "They belonged to my dad. He never wore them much, so they're practically new." Edward stared at the boots, overwhelmed by her thoughtfulness. "Sarah, this is too much," he protested. "You've already done so much for me." She waved off his concerns with a dismissive smile. "Nonsense. What good is having extra stuff if you can't share it with people who need it?" Her words echoed in his mind long after he left the diner that day. Sharing. It was such a simple concept, yet it carried profound meaning. In a society driven by acquisition and competition, sharing was often viewed as a weakness. But to Sarah, it was second nature, a reflection of her character and values. As the weeks passed, Edward found himself opening up more to Sarah. He shared stories of his travels, describing the places he'd visited and the people he'd met along the way. Some tales were humorous, others poignant, but all were delivered with a sense of nostalgia that hinted at a life rich with experience. Sarah listened intently, asking thoughtful questions and offering insights that surprised him with their depth. In return, she shared pieces of her own life, the challenges of raising Jake as a single mother, the sacrifices she'd made to provide for him, and the dreams she still held close to her heart. Her resilience inspired him, reminding him of the strength that lay within ordinary people. She wasn't extraordinary because of wealth or status. She was extraordinary because of her spirit. Yet even as their bond deepened, Edward remained guarded. He admired Sarah's kindness, but he also knew the dangers of lowering his defenses too soon. Trust, he had learned, was fragile, a delicate thread easily severed by betrayal. And so he continued observing, waiting for any sign that her intentions might shift. But the more time he spent with her, the harder it became to find fault. One Evening. As the diner emptied and the streetlights flickered to life outside, Sarah joined Edward in his booth after finishing her shift. They sat in companionable silence for a while, sipping cups of coffee and watching the snowflakes drift lazily past the window. Finally, Edward spoke, his voice soft but steady. "Sarah," he began, turning to face her, "do you ever wonder why you do the things you do? Why you go out of your way to help people even when it costs you something?" She tilted her head, considering the question. "I guess I don't think about it too much," she admitted. "I just believe that kindness matters. Even the smallest acts can make a big difference. Maybe not right away, but eventually." Edward nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "And what if the person you're helping doesn't deserve it?" he pressed. "What if they take advantage of your generosity?" Sarah smiled faintly, her eyes reflecting the warmth of the diner's dim lights. "Then I guess I'll have done my part," she replied. "I can't control how others act, but I can choose how I respond. And I choose kindness, no matter what." Her answer settled over him like a comforting blanket, wrapping him in a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years. In that moment, Edward realized he had found what he'd been searching for all along, someone whose integrity shone brighter than gold, someone who reminded him of the goodness still left in the world. Little did either of them know, their journey was far from over. The seeds of trust had been planted, but the true test of their bond and the revelation that would change everything was yet to come. It was a quiet evening at the diner, one of those rare nights when the crowd thinned early and the air felt unusually still. The rain tapped softly against the windows, creating a soothing rhythm that matched the gentle hum of the overhead lights. Sarah had just finished clearing the last table, stacking plates in the sink with a tired but content sigh. Her shift was almost over, and she looked forward to heading home to spend some quality time with Jake before bedtime. As she wiped down the counter, her eyes drifted toward Mr. Whitaker's usual booth. To her surprise, he was still there, sitting alone, staring out the rain-speckled window with an expression she couldn't quite place. Curiosity tugged at her, and she walked over, drying her hands on her apron. "Mr. Whitaker," she said, gently, leaning slightly against the edge of the booth. "Is everything all right? You've been sitting here for a while." He turned to look at her, his weathered face etched with lines that seemed deeper tonight. For a moment, he didn't speak, as if searching for the right words. Then, with a slow exhale, he gestured for her to sit across from him. "Sarah," he began, his voice low and steady, "there's something I need to tell you." Her heart skipped a beat, though she wasn't sure why. There was no alarm in his tone, only a quiet seriousness that made her sit up straighter. "Of course," she replied, sliding into the seat opposite him. "What is it?" Edward hesitated, his fingers tracing the rim of his coffee mug. Outside, the rain continued its steady patter, muffling the silence between them. Finally, he spoke. "I haven't been entirely honest with you," he admitted, his gaze meeting hers. "About who I am." Sarah blinked, unsure what to expect. "Okay," she said slowly, her brow furrowing. "Who are you then?" For the first time since they'd met, Edward allowed himself to drop the mask he'd worn for so long. He sat up straighter, his posture regal yet weary, as if carrying the weight of years he'd tried to leave behind. "My name isn't just Mr. Whitaker," he explained. "It's Edward Whitaker III, and I'm not exactly the man you think I am." Sarah tilted her head, confusion flickering across her face. "What do you mean?" Edward sighed, running a hand through his silver hair. "I'm a billionaire, or at least I used to be. I built a fortune decades ago, investing in technology companies that changed industries. My name was once everywhere, in newspapers, on billboards, in boardrooms. But fame and wealth, they came with a price. People stopped seeing me as a person. They saw my money first, and everything else second." Sarah listened intently, her mind racing to process what he was saying. A billionaire. This humble, unassuming man who drank black coffee and wore frayed scarves. It seemed impossible. Yet there was no trace of arrogance in his confession, only a deep weariness that hinted at truth. I left that world behind years ago, Edward continued. I sold my properties, gave away most of my possessions, and started traveling. I wanted to see if humanity still existed beyond the greed and superficiality I'd grown accustomed to. I wanted to find someone, anyone, who reminded me of what truly matters. His eyes softened as they settled on Sarah. And then I found you. Her cheeks flushed and she shook her head slightly. Me? Why me? I'm just a waitress trying to get by. Exactly, Edward said firmly. That's precisely why. You don't judge people based on what they have or don't have. You treat everyone with kindness and respect even when you're struggling yourself. Do you know how rare that is? In a world where most people are chasing wealth and status, you remind me of the beauty of simplicity, the power of genuine human connection. Sarah swallowed hard, overwhelmed by his words. But why didn't you tell me sooner? She asked, her voice tinged with both curiosity and disbelief. Because I needed to be sure, he confessed. Sure that your kindness wasn't motivated by ulterior motives. Sure that you weren't like the others, people who pretended to care, until they realized they couldn't benefit from me. So I tested you, Sarah, over and over again, and every single time you proved me wrong. Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes, though she quickly blinked them away. You were testing me? She whispered, her voice barely audible above the sound of the rain. Yes, Edward admitted, his own eyes glistening, and I'm sorry if it felt unfair. But trust doesn't come easily to me. Not anymore. Not after years of betrayal and disappointment. Finding someone like you, it's rare, and I needed to be certain. The weight of his revelation hung heavy in the air. But Sarah found herself smiling despite the whirlwind of emotions swirling inside her. Well, she said finally, her voice steadying, you didn't have to go through all that trouble. I'm just doing what anyone should, helping where I can, being kind because it's the right thing to do. Edward chuckled softly, shaking his head. That's exactly why I admire you, Sarah. Most people wouldn't understand that mindset. But you embody it. They sat in silence for a few moments, the rain outside providing a soothing backdrop to their shared understanding. Finally, Sarah broke the quiet. So now what? Does this change anything? Edward leaned back in the booth, his expression thoughtful. That depends on you, he said. I could walk out of here tomorrow and never return, and nothing would change. Or I could stay and perhaps we could build something together. Something meaningful. Sarah frowned, intrigued. What do you mean? He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, sliding it across the table toward her. Take a look, he urged. Unfolding the paper, Sarah scanned the contents, a list of businesses, properties, and investments, along with figures that made her jaw drop. This is yours? She stammered, looking up at him in disbelief. It is, Edward confirmed. And I've decided I want to use it differently. Not for myself, for people like you. People who deserve a chance to thrive without constantly worrying about survival. Sarah's mind raced, trying to comprehend the enormity of what he was offering. But why me? She repeated, her voice trembling. There are others who need help more than I do, because you've shown me that trust is worth giving, Edward replied simply. And because I believe in your potential. You've already done so much with so little. Imagine what you could accomplish with resources. Tears spilled down. Sarah's cheeks now no longer held back. I don't know what to say, she admitted, clutching the paper tightly. This is incredible. But I don't want you to feel obligated. I don't, Edward assured her. This isn't charity, Sarah, it's partnership. Together we can create opportunities for others. Opportunities that will ripple outward, touching lives far beyond this diner. The sincerity in his voice left no room for doubt. Sarah nodded slowly, her resolve strengthening. If that's true, if you really believe in me, then I won't let you down. Edward smiled, a genuine warmth spreading across his face. I know you won't, he said, and because that's who you are. As the rain continued to fall outside, washing away the remnants of the day, Sarah and Edward sat together in the cozy diner. Their bond transformed into something greater than either of them could have imagined. What had begun as a simple act of kindness, a cup of coffee given freely, had blossomed into a partnership rooted in trust, compassion, and a shared vision for a better future. And though neither of them knew exactly what lay ahead, one thing was certain: their lives would never be the same again. The days following Edward's revelation passed in a blur for Sarah. Her mind was a whirlwind of emotions: gratitude, disbelief, and a growing sense of responsibility. She replayed their conversation over and over in her head, marveling at how much had changed in such a short time. One moment she was just a waitress working long hours to make ends meet. The next she found herself entrusted with an opportunity most people could only dream of. It was exhilarating, yes, but also daunting. Could she really live up to Edward's expectations? And more importantly, could she stay true to herself while doing so? Edward, sensing her hesitation, gave her space to process everything. He didn't pressure her or rush her into making decisions. Instead, he continued visiting the diner as he always had, sitting in his corner booth and sipping his coffee. But now their conversations carried a new depth. They talked about ideas, big, ambitious dreams that stretched far beyond the walls of the diner. Edward shared stories of his past ventures, offering insights into the challenges and triumphs of building something from scratch. Sarah, in turn, spoke passionately about her hopes for the community, describing the struggles she saw every day and the ways she wanted to help. One evening, after closing time, Edward arrived at the diner accompanied by two sharply dressed individuals, a lawyer and a financial advisor. Sarah recognized them immediately as people who belonged to a world far removed from her own. Their polished shoes clicked against the tiled floor, and their briefcases gleamed under the fluorescent lights. For a moment, Sarah felt out of place, as if she were stepping onto a stage she wasn't prepared for. But Edward's calm demeanor reassured her. "Sarah," he began, gesturing toward the newcomers, "these are trusted colleagues of mine. We're here to discuss the details of what I mentioned earlier, the partnership." Her heart raced as they settled into a booth, spreading documents across the table. The lawyer explained the terms clearly, ensuring Sarah understood every aspect of the arrangement. Edward had transferred ownership of a lucrative commercial property near the town square to her name. It was a prime location, bustling with activity and ripe with potential. The property came with no strings attached, though Edward encouraged Sarah to use it wisely, to create something that would benefit not only her family but the entire community. "This is incredible," Sarah said, her voice trembling as she signed the final document. "But why me? Why give me something like this?" Edward smiled, his eyes softening. "Because you've earned it," he replied simply. "Not because of what you've done for me, but because of who you are. You've shown me that kindness isn't just a fleeting act, it's a way of life, and I believe you'll carry that spirit into whatever you choose to build." With the paperwork complete, Sarah stepped outside, the crisp night air filling her lungs. She looked up at the stars, feeling both overwhelmed and inspired. This was her chance to make a difference, to transform not only her own life but the lives of others. But where should she begin? Over the next few weeks, Sarah poured her energy into brainstorming ideas. She spent hours sketching plans on napkins, jotting down notes in the margins of old receipts, and bouncing thoughts off Edward during his visits. Together, they envisioned a space that would serve as more than just a business. It would be a hub for the community, a place where people could gather, learn, and grow. A community center, perhaps, offering job training programs, childcare services, and affordable meals for struggling families. Or maybe a co-op market, providing fresh produce and goods at reasonable prices. The possibilities seemed endless. Finally, one morning, Sarah approached Edward with a plan. "I want to turn the property into a multi-purpose center," she explained, her eyes shining with excitement. "It'll have classrooms for workshops, a cafe to employ local teens, and a food pantry for families in need. We can host events, offer resources, and create a space where everyone feels welcome. Edward listened intently, nodding approvingly. That sounds perfect, he said. It aligns perfectly with your values, and mine. Let's make it happen. With Edward's guidance and support, Sarah dove headfirst into the project. She reached out to friends, neighbors, and local organizations, rallying volunteers and gathering donations. Slowly but surely, the empty property began to take shape. Walls were painted in vibrant colors, shelves were stocked with supplies, and tables were set up to accommodate eager participants. The entire community rallied behind the effort, each person contributing in their own unique way. When the grand opening finally arrived, the streets buzzed with anticipation. Families streamed into the newly christened Harper Community Center, their faces lighting up as they explored the various rooms and activities. Children laughed in the play area, adults attended workshops on resume building and financial literacy, and seniors gathered in the cozy cafe to share stories over cups of coffee. Sarah stood in the midst of it all, watching with tears in her eyes as her vision came to life. Edward watched from the sidelines, his heart swelling with pride. He hadn't expected to find someone like Sarah when he first walked into the diner, months ago. Yet here she was, transforming not only her own life but the lives of countless others. Her selflessness reminded him of the humanity he'd once feared was lost forever. And though he knew their paths might diverge in the future, he felt certain that their bond would endure. As the celebration continued, Sarah sought out Edward, pulling him aside for a quiet moment. "Thank you," she said, earnest. "Qing shi biao da ganxie zhi qing he dui wei lai de cheng nuo." Years passed, and the Harper Community Center became the heart of the small town. What had once been an empty commercial property was now a vibrant hub of activity, a place where laughter echoed through the halls, where friendships blossomed, and where lives were transformed. Families gathered for weekend events, children learned new skills in workshops, and struggling individuals found hope in the form of job training programs and affordable resources. The center wasn't just a building, it was a testament to the power of kindness, hard work, and collaboration. Sarah, too, had grown in ways she never imagined. She went from being a single mother working tirelessly at the diner to becoming a leader and advocate for her community. Her days were still long, but they were filled with purpose. She mentored young people, organized fundraisers, and collaborated with local businesses to expand the center's reach. Jake, her son, grew up watching his mother pour her heart into helping others, and he absorbed those lessons like a sponge. By the time he graduated high school, he knew exactly what he wanted to do: follow in his mom's footsteps by pursuing a career in social work. Edward Whitaker remained a constant presence in Sarah's life, though their roles evolved over time. He no longer visited the diner daily. His travels took him to other towns and cities. But he stayed connected, checking in regularly and offering advice when needed. Inspired by Sarah's success, he began dedicating more of his wealth to similar projects across the country. Together they formed a partnership that transcended geography, united by a shared mission to uplift communities and foster genuine human connection. One crisp autumn afternoon, several years after the community center opened, Sarah received an unexpected call from Edward. "I'm coming back to town," he announced, his voice warm and familiar. "There's something I'd like to show you." Curious and excited, Sarah arranged to meet him at the center later that week. When the day arrived, she found him standing outside, flanked by a team of architects and city planners. In his hands, he held a set of blueprints, which he unrolled on one of the tables inside. "This," he said, pointing to the designs, "is my next project, a regional initiative to replicate what you've built here in other underserved areas, and I want you to lead it." Sarah stared at the plans, her breath catching in her throat. The scope of the project was staggering. Multiple centers, each tailored to the unique needs of its community, all interconnected by a network of support and resources. It was bold, ambitious, and breathtakingly beautiful. But why me? She asked, echoing the question she'd posed so many times before. You could hire experts, people with degrees and experience, and yet none of them have what you have, Edward replied firmly. Heart, resilience, a deep understanding of what these communities truly need. You've proven yourself, Sarah, over and over again. This is your chance to take everything you've learned and share it with the world. Tears welled in her eyes as she looked at him, gratitude swelling in her chest. I don't know what to say, she admitted, softly. Say yes, Edward urged, a twinkle in his eye. The world needs more people like you. She nodded, her resolve strengthening. Yes, she said finally, her voice steady despite the emotions coursing through her. Let's do it. As the years rolled on, Sarah and Edward worked tirelessly to bring their vision to life. New centers sprang up in towns and cities across the region, each one reflecting the spirit of the original Harper Community Center. Sarah traveled frequently, mentoring leaders and ensuring that every location stayed true to its mission. Along the way, she inspired countless others to join the cause, creating a ripple effect of positive change that reached farther than she ever thought possible. Edward, meanwhile, rediscovered a sense of fulfillment he hadn't felt in decades. Through Sarah, he saw the best of humanity, not the greed or selfishness that had once disillusioned him, but the boundless capacity for compassion and generosity. He began documenting their journey, writing letters and essays about the importance of trust, integrity, and kindness. His words resonated deeply, earning him recognition not as a billionaire but as a philosopher and advocate for meaningful change. Despite their busy schedules, Sarah and Edward always made time for each other. They met regularly to discuss progress, share stories, and reflect on how far they'd come. Their bond had grown beyond mentorship or friendship. It was a partnership rooted in mutual respect and admiration. Sarah often joked that Edward was the grandfather she never had, while Edward teased her about being the daughter who kept him grounded. One evening, as they sat together in the cozy cafe of the original community center, Sarah turned to him with a thoughtful expression. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't bought you that cup of coffee all those years ago? She asked. Edward chuckled, leaning back in his chair. All the time, he admitted. But then I remind myself that it wasn't just the coffee. It was you. Your kindness, your willingness to see beyond appearances, your belief in doing the right thing, even when it costs you something. That's what changed everything. Sarah smiled, feeling a surge of warmth. Well, I guess we're both lucky then, because you taught me just as much as I taught you. Edward nodded, his gaze drifting toward the window. Outside, the sun was setting, casting golden light over the bustling streets. People laughed and chatted as they walked by, carrying groceries, holding hands, sharing moments. It was a scene of ordinary beauty, one that reminded them both of why they did what they did. We're leaving a legacy, Edward said quietly. Not of wealth or fame, but of connection. Of reminding people that no matter how hard life gets, there's always room for kindness. Sarah reached out, placing a hand on his arm. And we'll keep doing it, she promised. Together. As the night fell and the lights of the community center glowed warmly against the dark sky, Sarah and Edward sat in comfortable silence, content in the knowledge that they had created something extraordinary. From a simple act of kindness, a free cup epilogue, decades later, long after Edward had passed away and Sarah had retired, the impact of their partnership endured. The network of community centers they built continued to thrive, touching the lives of millions. Stories of their journey were told and retold, inspiring new generations to believe in the power of compassion and collaboration. In the end, it wasn't the billions or the buildings that defined them. It was the quiet moments, the acts of kindness, and the unwavering belief that even the smallest gestures can spark monumental change. And as Sarah often said in her speeches, it all started with a cup of coffee.